Namaskaram and welcome to Biz1st Review 360, where we bring you a roundup of this week's top business stories and developments that impact the economy. I'm Azra Khan. On our top story tonight, the central bank kept key policy rates unchanged but warned of increasing credit to state-owned business enterprises.
On private sector credit, one of the reasons why the Monetary Board left rates unchanged was the expectation that private sector credit would ease down during the course of the year, because as you know, there is a up to 12-month transmission period for monetary policy. So the change in March, for it to work through, I think for the moment the Monetary Board is comfortable that private sector credit will ease down, and as you saw from the presentation, inflation will come down to the mid-single digit level that is our target. Credit to public corporation increased largely due to borrowings by CPC, which increased by 6.9 billion rupees, RDA 0.3 billion and NIBM 0.3 billion.
First 4 months.
For the first 4 months. On a cumulative basis, credit to public corporations increased by 62.2 billion during the first 4 months of 2017 compared to a contraction of rupees 28 billion during 2016. The disconnect between bank credit and the treasury bill rate, I suspect it's only a question of time, because it's really in the, you will see it getting reflected in bank interest rates as well. This downward drift in the government securities market. There is only one prior action that has to be completed. That is the tabling in Parliament of the Inland Revenue Bill. You would have seen now in the government printer's website that it has been gazetted. The date was, I think, 19th of June. So then there will be 10 working days after which the bill will be tabled in Parliament, and then we would have satisfied all the requirements. The IMF Executive Board is expected to meet during the second week of July, and our expectation now is that that should be approved. The review will go through and the next tranche will be forthcoming. When we made the forecast at the beginning of the year, we were not aware how severe the drought would be in the first couple of quarters, and then now we've had the disruption due to floods. Now the reconstruction and rehabilitation after the floods will give a bit of a bounce to the growth process in the second half of the year. Now the first half of the year is going to end up with about 3.8% growth. So if we if we can get 5% or a little higher, you can end up the year somewhere between 4.5 and 5. Also hoping that exports pick up as well, with GSP Plus kicking in.
Welcome back. You're watching Biz1st Review 360. Public procurement is a key instrument through which governments deliver important social and economic goods to citizens. Does Sri Lanka have an efficient, accountable public procurement system? Let's find out.
Our next guest this evening is going to tell us all about electronic procurement. E-government procurement, to be specific. She's Sabrina Yusufali, Head of Legal at Verite Research. Sabrina, thank you very much for joining us on Biz1st Review 360. This report actually came out some time ago, and it's been raising a few, or been capturing the attention of several people, focused on improving government efficiency, etc., etc. Can you tell us a little bit about what the findings of Verite's report on e-government procurement was?
Yeah, thanks. I think first it's important to understand what we mean when we talk about public procurement. When I talk to people about public procurement, often people think about procurement in the sense of these big construction contracts. But really the spectrum of procurement includes every single thing that the government purchases. So from, obviously highways and big ticket construction items to things like pens or chairs fall within the gamut of public procurement. So it's not surprising then when we think about the public procurement marketplace as being 596 billion in 2016. So you're talking about a significant amount of government spending that goes in the public procurement marketplace. So what we've spotted very broadly is that we have three key problems in our procurement marketplace. One is the complete lack of information with regard to tender notices. Suppliers aren't informed when tender notices are changed. We have no idea what the government procurement plans are like for the next 2 years, which makes it very difficult for suppliers that are not in the know to really gear up to meet government demand. So information, a huge problem. The second issue, and this applies both to private sector suppliers and to government, is that procurement is extremely costly. Why? Because it's extremely labor intensive. The whole process is quite manual. If you are a private sector supplier, you'd have to go to the procurement or the government agency 2 or 3 times to ask very basic questions. You'd have to appoint someone to look through your newspapers every morning to figure out when a tender notice was being published. And on the government side, it could take up to 3 months to procure a pen because of the extent of kind of the administration required to do simple procurement processes. And the third, and this is the issue that's gained the most kind of public attention, is the level of anti-competitive practices that exist in the public procurement marketplace. We've heard a lot about, a lot of bids are happening outside the process, unsolicited bids. But also even in the event where bids go through the process, they're often manipulated a little bit to suit the specifications of a particular supplier. And I think a big part of why anti-competitive practices go unnoticed is partly because we just don't have enough information to challenge it. For example, successful bids aren't published.
There's a lack of transparency in the procurement process.
Absolutely. So because successful bids aren't published, if I was a supplier that was jilted by the system, there's no basis on which I could contest it, right? And this is an issue that's been brought up over and over again, but I think it's important to stress that all of these three problems lead to inefficiency in the procurement system, which ultimately cost the taxpayer.
Does Sri Lanka have the capacity to introduce a e-government procurement system?
Yeah, I think that if we start realizing the fact that procurement is actually costing the taxpayer. So an example, a study was published in 2014 that found that actually highways were being overcharged by 135%. That's a cost of 200 billion to the taxpayer, right? So the moment we realize the absolute wrong that's happening in the procurement marketplace at present, that's when we start thinking about reform in a serious way. And often when you pitch ideas of reform, what you hear back from people in government is, don't worry about it. We're drafting a great new law. But I think time has come to start talking about implementation. Time has come to start talking about good systems. And how the good systems and how good systems can work for us, right? So e-procurement is a system that can solve a majority of the issues that I brought up at the start. And essentially what it is that it essentially digitizes procurement from the point of tender notices right up until the point of award. So the whole procurement process is digitized on a centralized platform. Now when I talk to people about e-procurement, often I hear the question, this is a pie-in-the-sky idea. We're really not ready for it. But if you think about the countries that have adopted e-procurement, they're countries that we consider ourselves more advanced than, right? So Bangladesh, Nepal, Vietnam, Afghanistan, all of them have e-procurement systems that have worked out very well for them. And you don't have to just trust me. You don't have to trust me saying it's a great system. Luckily, because we're so late to this party, we have a lot of really great data to go by. Right? So in Bangladesh, they found that after the introduction of e-procurement, the whole tender process went from being 51 days to 26 days. that's nearly cutting the tender time in half, right? So you're talking about significant amounts of time saving, which ultimately results in both savings to the government and to private sector.
I suppose the introduction of e-procurement would also go a long way towards stemming corruption, because procurement is one of the areas where you see a lot of corruption taking place in the public sector. Does that mean that there's also going to be a lot of resistance to it?
Yes, I think we can anticipate a significant amount of resistance to it, but that's not a good enough reason as to why we shouldn't have it, right? So I think in Mexico, an interesting example is after they introduced the e-procurement system, a group of journalists actually went and asked the president's office for details of its procurement, and they found out that the president in Mexico at the time had been spending something like $500 on his towels. So it was actually called Towelgate. But yes, I think that in addition to all of the costs that cost savings that you can incur with e-procurement, you're also talking about completely opening up your procurement marketplace, to more people, so small and medium enterprises now have a fighting chance, and B, you're talking about, because of the increased transparency that e-procurement brings, you're also talking about reducing the incentives for corruption, or reducing the margin of discretion.
Sabrina, can I also ask you now, what sort of digital infrastructure is Sri Lanka's, at least in the public sector, do we have the digital infrastructure to go in for e-procurement? If not, how long will it take, and also how long will it take to implement, and also does it require fresh legislation to implement?
So when I think about e-procurement, I think about it in three phases, right? So initially, if all it was, right, is a single platform that the government can publish all of its tender notices in one place, tender notices that are searchable. If it can publish all of the government's procurement plans, I would say that's a pretty great start. There is nothing in the current procurement guidelines that prohibit it. In fact, it permits it. And certain government entities actually do publish tender notices online and successful bids online. So it's to say that this is entirely possible. It's just we need to think about centralizing it. That's possible in a 6 to 1 year time frame. And this is that's right up until the point where bids are submitted online. So if you think about the second phase, perhaps, of e-procurement, that's going to take a bit of time because we will have to amend our current regulations that prohibit electronic. But again, these are about a 2 to 3 year time frame. For me, that's entirely doable. And if we think about, even with a basic system, if we can save 1%, right, in our procurement marketplace, we're looking at 6 billion rupees. So for me, the question, we always ask the question, is Sri Lanka ready for it, or can we handle it? For me, I ask the question, what's taking so long, right? Why are we here?
Sabrina, also, before I let you go, one final question. So you've got this report, this fantastic report out on e-government procurement, how it would work in Sri Lanka, etc., etc. What's the next step going beyond this? What would you like to see happening immediately after?
As I said, I'd like to wake up tomorrow morning and find out that we have a centralized website where the government essentially uploads all of its tender notices and all of its successful bids. That's the dream.
Sabrina, thank you very much for joining us on Biz1st Review 360. Yeah. It's been a pleasure.
You're most welcome.
Welcome back to the program. Now a look at the state of state-owned enterprises in Sri Lanka.
State sector enterprises have been making headlines over the past week or so, especially after the recently concluded cabinet reshuffle, which saw a number of state sector enterprises being assigned to different ministries, especially which do not come under its purview. Now, state sector enterprises are indeed a vital factor to any country's economy, and to speak on the topic, we have Mr. Ravi Ratnasabapathy, who is a fellow of the Advocata Institute. A very good evening to you, Mr. Ratnasabapathy, and welcome to the show.
Good evening.
Now we know the national airlines, Sri Lankan Airlines, concerns were raised against the airlines, saying that a number of appointments were made to its cadre following the appointment of the current board. Mr. Ratna Sabapati, let's get to the bigger picture here. Levels have always been charged that state sector enterprises are used by politicians as a vehicle for political patronage. Is this true?
Yes, that is actually one of the problems with it's not just losses, but the fact that the people within the political system want to use them to give jobs to their chosen constituents, which is why you see this very unseemly scramble for various ministries and for the institutions under them. You don't see people usually fighting over the archaeology department or the survey department, where people of a fairly technically qualified level need to be appointed. But almost everything else, there's people wanting to put their own people in. So that's probably one of the issues that come up with Air Lanka as well.
If I'm not mistaken, over the past 11 years, our public sector has grown by over 500,000 people. We have over 50% of our tax revenue which is being directed towards the maintenance of these public service sectors. But do you think our public sector is efficient? Do you think that the government should be into business?
Right, that's a very good question that you raise. On one hand, we have had this huge increase in the number of public servants. We had 850,000 in 2005. We are now at 1.3 million. Right, the pensions and salaries take up 50% of the tax revenue that the government earns. Now the question is this the priority of the government? Have we got our priorities right? Now Sri Lanka is an aging country. We have a rich country demographic, but we are still a developing nation. As our population ages, there are services that the elderly require. In 2012, there were 2.5 million people who were over the age of 60. It's expected to grow to 3.6 million by 2021. Now the elderly require specialized geriatric care. There's diseases like Alzheimer's, dementia, heart disease, cancer. Our health system needs to gear itself to cope with the changes in the population. But is our spending really directed in that way, or are we just putting in people to give them jobs?
We have about 1.3 million people in our public sector workforce. Is there readily available information, like a breakdown as to who exactly this 1.3 million are?
Yes, the Finance Ministry annual report gives us a breakdown. There was also a survey done by the Department of Census and Statistics, which is not complete because they excluded the military from that survey. But according to the Finance Ministry annual report, we have a total of 1.353 million people who are under the public sector. We have created 25,000 new positions in 2016. We also have 597,464 pensioners. In total, the public sector of the workforce of 8 million is almost 15 or 16% of your workforce is in the public sector. So of the 1.3 million, we have about 19,000 doctors, we have 32,000 nurses, but we also have 50,000 people called development officers. Now I'm not very sure what a development officer does. It would be interesting to see what their job description of a typical development officer is. If we look at the other big numbers, we have in the public service 25,000 drivers. We have 72,000 people who are termed semi-skilled laborers. We have 166,000 office aides or peons. Right? In total, if you look at the drivers, the semi-skilled workers, the office aides, we have 264,000 people.
That must be bigger than the country's military capacity.
The military is about 272,000. That was the figure that was in last year's annual report. It's not separately disclosed in this one, but it's pretty. We have an army of peons and clerks and office aides who are almost as large as the military.
You speak about 19,000 doctors. How is it when it comes to the education sector?
We have about 230,000 teachers, which is okay, provided that they are fit and qualified to teach properly. But that number is not a particularly alarming one. What is alarming is this other card that we have got.
So we have 1.3 million people in the public sector, and Sri Lanka has about 20 million population. So that's a ratio, if I'm not mistaken, about 1:15.
Yes, that's right.
Why is it our public sector is so inefficient? Why do we lag behind, and why are so many of the public sector institutes loss making then? We should be having a very well flushed and flourishing public sector, don't you think, at that ratio?
Yes, in a sense we certainly have a lot of people. Now, are these people able to provide us with services of value? That is the question that members of the public need to ask themselves. If I was the Minister of Health, I'd ask myself, we provide a free health service, yet why are so many people paying and going into private hospitals? If I was the Minister of Education, I'd ask myself, we provide schooling that's free at the point of delivery, but why are so many people going in for these tuition classes? Why are so many people paying for private schooling whenever they can afford it? Is there something wrong with what the public sector is doing? Now, these are questions that would need to be asked by the public in general. If we look at the overall public sector, we need to look at the 3 E's: efficiency, economy and effectiveness. Those are the 3 pillars on which you would measure how much value the public service is delivering. If you look at efficiency, it's just a question of input and output, how much went in and how much came out. In terms of economy, it's the overall revenues and the costs, and how little or how much you were able to spend. There's effectiveness, which is ultimately how far the expenditure reaches the stated goals.
So do you think that officials, the public officials in Sri Lanka, actually carry out studies to see whether their departments are effective, efficient and having a good economy impact on the nation?
Well, to my knowledge, it's not done, but I think that is something that we should ask our politicians and the public, to keep asking our ministers and our government officials to measure what they do, because unless we measure, we don't really know whether they deserve a pat on the back or a kick up the backside.
So what exactly is the way forward for our public sector?
Yes, that's a very big question. I think we really need to rethink our public sector overall, what we are spending money on, what our priorities should be, and are we getting value for this for the money that is being spent. The individual departments, now the RTI Act requires that each department publish a scorecard of its of what it's been doing. They need to really take that to heart and implement that, and tell people what services are provided, what their objectives are, how far they've achieved their objectives, what they've been spending their money on, instead of just keeping it a blank wall from which we can't really, a black box from which we have no way of getting information.
Well, we do hope that the relevant officials will take heed and take note of what was said, and that they will take the relevant necessary measures to make sure that our public sector indeed is more effective, more efficient, and will have a more positive impact on the country's economy. Well, that's it from here for tonight.
That's all the news we have for you tonight. Good night and have a wonderful weekend.